Hi there. This presentation is one that I gave at the New England Historical Association conference in the fall of 2020, and I thought I'd share it with you because it's relevant to the topic at hand, and you probably even did a little bit of reading of my original text. So, it's been said to understand American diplomacy, one must know something about American culture. It's also true that to understand American culture, you got to know something about American religion. As the world emerged from the Second World War and the United States developed into hegemonic power, the country's culture and specifically its religion played an influential role in diplomacy. The 1950s marked a significant increase in religious affiliation in America. While many of the voices joined an effort to craft America's civil religion, a central character in its evolution and its connection to the American conception as a global power was Henry Luce. Luce was the devout son of Christian missionaries. He was the founder and editor of several influential magazines, and he was brazen about the fact that he sought to create and control a national consensus. Central questions for my study were how these ideas represented in Luce of globalism and Christianity played into the development of this hegemonic Cold War Americanism. The research that I did used one of Henry Luce's periodicals, Life magazine. But I think it added light to those questions about globalism and Christianity. Luce intended to use Life to influence, and he knew the impact that visual images could have in persuading the public. Think about today, what gets read on Twitter or whatever social media we might be looking at. It's the images that attract our attention first, right? And Luce understood this 75, 80 years ago. In 1937, he said, "Now, to me, the most exciting discovery which we have stumbled into is the extraordinary power of the photograph to dramatize and lend fresh interest, news interest, to the good." He aimed to use photographic angle on the news, both the pleasant and the unpleasant. And whether in photographic form or written word, it quickly becomes clear, as historian James Brahman states, and by 1940, Luce's publications at times deliberately presented news in ways that revealed Luce's preoccupations. So you'll see things constantly and consistently in Life magazine, for instance, that show America with great moral strength and a moral imperative. I focused on Life magazine for several reasons. First, Luce was open about his desire to effect a religious Americanism. More importantly, Life wasn't the acknowledged publication of record at the time. So therefore, he had the means to attempt such influence. Beyond that, Life was an image-rich source, so it was likely to contain a range of signs, quote unquote, both written and visual. Someone else did a little bit of a study before me. A gentleman named Daniel Morgan examined Life magazine from 1936 to 1951 and found religious subjects were especially common in the first 15 years of Life magazine. I picked up on this research and examined coverage by the media as the Cold War began to heat up in the 1950s. And while civic religion was often indistinct in its theology, it was clear in Life magazine that the Judeo-Christian country of the United States was superior to those practicing other world religions in the mind of Luce. The civil religion examples ranged from the passing quotation of President Truman, who used the phrase, "by the grace of God," in the State of the Union in 1950, to the dramatic last 12 paragraphs of John Foster Dulles' 15-page essay in April of 1950. In the essay, Dulles tells the readers that one thing comes before applying the pressure of faith and confidence: their possession. Right? So you have to have faith and confidence before you can apply the pressure that faith and confidence provide. Right? Obvious. Right? He warns that no attack, military, political, or moral, can be launched and fought with doubt and vacillation. You got to be confident. And then he bemoans that something's gone wrong with a nation. Right? We don't have that faith and that confidence in America. He tells them that defensiveness and fear are new in our history. That this is not something that's American. We're not fearful. We don't doubt. We don't vacillate. He tells them that our greatest need is to regain that confidence in our spiritual heritage. Right? This isn't imagine the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal saying these kinds of things today, even in their editorial page. Now, the interpretation of signs is a complex challenge. Signs are tools used in the construction of meaning. That construction requires the use of language and classification systems, which are a function of culture. As I mentioned earlier, it's virtually impossible to analyze American culture without some recognition of a religion. Paul Tillich puts it this way: as religion is a substance of culture, so culture is a form of religion. So the significance and the power of popular religious imagery resides precisely in its contribution to the social construction of reality. It's evident throughout the pages of Life that its writers and editors would have Americans understand that the Cold War was not a question only of policy decisions and physical threats, but a moral contest for the soul of their neighbors and the globe. Now, this was a real undertaking to do this research. There are 520 issues of a weekly magazine from the period that I surveyed. Right? The 1950s, a decade, 52 weeks a year times 10. 520 issues. So in these issues, I identified signs, both images and printed word, of religion and their connection to concepts of Americanism. And in this period, I identified 665 articles that included such a sign. So in 520 issues, there were 665 articles that included a sign of religion and their connection to the concept of Americanism. So more than one per issue. These results support the idea that religiosity was on the rise in the 1950s. Morgan, before me, found 683 occurrences in 750 issues between 37 and 51. Right? So the density of the issues actually increased in the 1950s. Religion made the cover of Life magazine 10 times in the 10 years reviewed. In 1950, I found 59 articles that contained signs of religion. While the bulk of these articles were articles with primarily religious subjects, they included in this number articles in which public policy or other secular subjects were the primary subject, but the clear reference to religion was made. Of these items, 43 were readily identified as references to Judeo-Christian tradition. 6 were from traditions identifiable outside the Judeo-Christian faiths, and 10 couldn't really be placed in a specific tradition. Those not placed in a specific tradition were items that most clearly expressed the concept of a civil religion. There were only 2 instances when the references to religion were not entirely positive. Both of those came to describe conflicts between Catholicism and evangelical Protestant. This moral religious superiority translated, sometimes quite overtly, into justification for an interventionist foreign policy. Right? The communist needle, always poised, was jabbing at the sore spot in Germany last week. Images within Life magazine balanced the messages of America's greatness with Satan's threat quite deftly, generally showing the consequences of unbelief in foreign lands. Pictures of Eastern European non-believing crowds were angry and despondent, while American Christians were happy and peaceful. March 1950 was representative of what you'd see in the magazine frequently. Although there wasn't a religious photo on the cover, the lead block letter headline in reverse color font was "The Search for St. Peter's Bones." The headline promised full color photos, but before you can reach the headline article, moving from front to back through the pages sequentially, you first come to a story of how divine intervention saved a church choir. The article explains seeming innocuous reasons for every member of the Westside Baptist Church's choir in Beatrice, Nebraska, why they were late to choir rehearsal before getting to the punchline that the church exploded as a result of a probable gas leak. The article concludes with an unattributed quote which explains that divine intervention, this was an act of God. Continuing to move through the magazine, the reader comes to a dramatic 2-page photo essay of the evangelical preacher Reverend Billy Graham and his record-setting crowds. The article begins with a full-page picture of Billy Graham in the foreground, arms outstretched with seemingly thousands of people in the crowds before him. Other pictures in the essay include a shot of the preacher on stage with a gubernatorial candidate, Graham drawing the flock of thousands, again with arms raised, and some of this on their knees in prayer. The caption below this last picture was also worth noting for its use of battle imagery. We're told after a few more stops in the South, Graham intended to invade New England. This idea of Christian warriors was millennial old, but it takes on new and additional meaning throughout history when it's juxtaposed with real wars between nation states. In this case, the war was cold, but not less real in the minds of many Americans. It's important here to remember while Billy Graham and others were on a crusade, the readers of Life magazine a couple months earlier had been told that Catholics had been pursued and persecuted by the Antichrist of communism. The Antichrist of communism. It is with this kind of alternating images that Life most frequently casts the environment of the Cold War. Good, wholesome, religious Americans, atheist, Antichrist communists. So now, back to this 1950 magazine, right? After all these stories, you finally get to the cover story, that full cover, that full color images are really striking. And only one other image in the issue, save the advertisement, was in color. So the images, not surprisingly, were demonstrably Christian. And the essay that accompanies it was extensive. The global consequences of the war against communism notwithstanding, Life's message was centered on domestic society. So while it certainly advocated for a robust anti-communist foreign policy, what Life magazine was really trying to do was to convert Americans to the Christian anti-communism. Now, most Americans are not going to be part of foreign policy, right? So this coverage that's represented in the magazine by Billy Graham is probably the most illustrative, right? Graham rose to prominence on the back of his explicit connection of Americanism, Christianity, and anti-communism. Graham and others, such as Fulton Sheen, in tying their themes of Americanism to their religious conviction, contributed to the development of a single national American religion. And this discourse was advanced by Luce's periodicals. In that aforementioned trip to South Carolina, this was a critical one for Graham's career because while he was there, so was Henry Luce. And a meeting between the two was arranged by the governor. And by the end of that trip, Luce was convinced that Graham was vital to America. From then on, Time and Life magazine, two of Luce's periodicals, carried about everything I did, according to Graham. One interesting side note, which wasn't the focus of my study, but I think it bears further investigation, is how the process of developing its communism and antichrist narrative, Life also tread a precarious line regarding science, often belittling scientists as simplistic. So there you are. Religion in the pages of Life magazine and its influence on the development of an anti-communist America in the 1950s.